By 1943, every Jewish community that fell under Nazi control was destroyed. That was not a fear. That was not a rumor filtering through the underground. That was the documented, observable, operational reality of the German occupation across the continent. Poland, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, country after country, city after city, community after community. The machinery of the final solution moved with a systematic efficiency that left no room for exception. The Jews of Thessaloniki had watched this happen from a distance. They had read the reports. They had heard the testimonies of refugees who arrived in Greece carrying stories that were almost too terrible to believe. They had watched the war move across Europe with the specific anxiety of people who understood that what was happening to other Jewish communities might eventually reach them. But Thessaloniki was different, or so many believed. Thessaloniki's Jewish community was not a recent arrival. It was not a small minority clinging to the margins of a city that belonged to someone else. It was 2,000 years old. It had been in Thessaloniki longer than the Ottoman Empire, longer than the Byzantine Empire, longer than any of the political structures that had risen and fallen around it. The Jews of Thessaloniki had survived everything: Persian invasions, Roman occupation, Byzantine persecution, Ottoman rule, 4 centuries under the Sultans, during which Thessaloniki's Jewish community grew so large and so central to the city's economic life that the city itself was sometimes called the Mother of Israel. A city where Jewish merchants spoke Ladino, the medieval Spanish of their Sephardic ancestors, in the markets and the coffee houses and the synagogues that lined the streets of the Old Quarter. They had survived everything for 2,000 years. They did not survive the Germans. What happened to the Jewish community of Thessaloniki between March and August 1943 is one of the most complete destructions of an ancient community in the entire history of the Holocaust. Not the largest in absolute numbers, but in terms of what was lost: the age of the community, the depth of its roots, the irreplaceable cultural heritage that went with it. One of the most devastating. 19 train transports, 5 months, 96% murdered. This is their story. To understand what happened to the Jews of Thessaloniki in 1943, you have to go back further than 1943. You have to go back to 1492. In that year, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain signed the Alhambra Decree, the order expelling all Jews from the Spanish kingdom. Hundreds of thousands of people who had lived in Spain for centuries, who spoke Spanish, who had built communities and businesses and synagogues in every major Spanish city, were given 4 months to leave or convert. Most left, and many of them came to Thessaloniki. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II, who controlled Thessaloniki at the time, welcomed them. He reportedly said that Ferdinand had impoverished his own kingdom by expelling people of such skill and industry and enriched his own. He invited the Spanish Jews, the Sephardim, to settle in his territories. They came to Thessaloniki in their thousands, and they built something extraordinary. By the 16th century, Thessaloniki's Jewish community was the largest in the world. The city's economy ran on Jewish labor and Jewish commerce. The port, one of the most important in the Eastern Mediterranean, was operated almost entirely by Jewish dockworkers, Jewish merchants, Jewish ship owners. On the Jewish Sabbath, the port of Thessaloniki closed, not because the authorities ordered it, because the workers who ran it were Jewish, and they were observing their day of rest. The entire commercial life of one of the Mediterranean's most important ports paused for the Jewish Sabbath for centuries. This is not a metaphor for Jewish influence in the city. It is a documented operational fact about how the port of Thessaloniki actually functioned. The language they brought from Spain, Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, the medieval Castilian of their ancestors, was preserved with remarkable fidelity across 4.5 centuries. While Spanish itself evolved into modern Spanish, the Ladino spoken in Thessaloniki retained features of 15th century Castilian that had disappeared from Spain itself. Linguists who study Ladino describe it as a kind of linguistic time capsule, a window into how Spanish sounded before the changes that transformed the language in the 16th and 17th centuries. This continued for 4 centuries, through Ottoman rule, through the Balkan Wars, through the transition to Greek sovereignty in 1913, through the First World War, through the difficult interwar years when Greek nationalism created new pressures on the city's Jewish minority. By 1940, Thessaloniki's Jewish community numbered approximately 50,000 people. In a city of around 250,000, they were roughly 1/5 of the population. They maintained their synagogues, more than 30 of them across the city, their schools, their newspapers published in Ladino and Greek, their cultural organizations, their cemeteries, including the ancient Jewish cemetery that contained 500,000 graves, the accumulated dead of 2,500 years of Jewish life in the city. They were Thessalonians, they were Greeks, they were Jews, all three simultaneously, with no contradiction between them. Among them was a young woman named Erica Amariglio. Erica was born in Thessaloniki in 1926. Her father was a businessman. Her family was educated, comfortable, integrated into the city's life in the way that families who have lived somewhere for generations become integrated, not as outsiders tolerated by the majority, but as people for whom this place is simply home. She spoke Ladino at home. She spoke Greek in the street. She went to school in Thessaloniki. She had friends whose families had been in the city as long as hers had. She was 17 years old when the Germans came for her. The Germans had occupied Thessaloniki since April 1941, part of the rapid conquest of Greece that followed Italy's failed invasion. For the first year and a half of occupation, the Jewish community experienced persecution and humiliation, but not yet the systematic destruction that had already consumed Jewish communities elsewhere. The humiliations were deliberate and calculated. In July 1942, German forces rounded up Jewish men in Liberty Square, the central public square of the city, and forced them to perform humiliating exercises in the summer heat for hours while German soldiers and Greek bystanders watched. This event, known as Black Sabbath, was photographed by the Germans and the photographs circulated. It was designed to degrade, to demonstrate powerlessness, to establish in public what the German occupation intended. The Jewish community leadership, trying to protect its members, negotiated a ransom arrangement, paying the Germans to release the men from forced labor obligations. The ransom was enormous. It stripped the community of significant resources, and it did not protect them from what came next. The rules changed in February 1943. Adolf Eichmann sent 2 of his most efficient deputies to Thessaloniki. Dieter Wislichny had already organized the deportation of Slovak Jews. Alois Brunner had already organized the deportation of Jews from France, Austria, and Greece's own Jewish communities in other cities. Their assignment in Thessaloniki was the deportation of the entire Jewish community to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Their timeline was aggressive. Their methods were built on a deception that had been refined across dozens of previous operations. They told the Jewish community They were being resettled in Krakow, Poland, that they would work, that families would stay together, that they should bring their valuables and their tools because they would need them in their new home, that those who registered and reported as instructed would be treated well, that those who resisted or fled would face severe consequences not just for themselves but for their families. It was a lie refined to the point of operational perfection. Chief Rabbi Zvi Koretz headed the Jewish community's leadership during this period. His role remains one of the most contested aspects of the Thessaloniki story. He had been appointed to his position under German pressure, already a compromise that placed him in an impossible position between his community and its destroyers. The information available to him about what resettlement actually meant was limited and filtered through German assurances designed to prevent panic. He conveyed the German instructions to his community. He urged compliance. Whether this reflected a genuine belief in the German promises, a calculation that cooperation offered the best chance of minimizing harm, or some combination of both, historians continue to debate. What is not debated is the outcome. The deportations began on March 15, 1943. March 15, 1943. Thessaloniki. The first transport assembles at the Baron Hirsch neighborhood, the poorest Jewish quarter of the city, chosen by the Germans as the staging area because its population was most vulnerable and least able to resist or escape. Families are told to bring 50 kilograms of luggage each, food for several days, money, valuables, everything they will need for their new life in Poland. They line up with their suitcases and their bundles and their children and their elderly parents. Some of them have heard rumors about what resettlement actually means. Most have chosen not to believe those rumors because the alternative, that the Germans intend to murder an entire community of 50,000 people, is a thought so enormous and so unprecedented that the human mind reaches for any other explanation. The first transport carries 2,800 people. They are loaded into cattle cars, not passenger carriages, cattle cars, wooden freight wagons with no seats, no windows, no sanitation. 80, 90, sometimes over 100 people pressed into a space designed for livestock. The doors are sealed from the outside. The train moves north. The journey to Auschwitz-Birkenau takes 5 to 8 days. Think about what those specific days in a sealed cattle car means. No food beyond what they brought. Water running out within the first days. The sanitation situation becoming unbearable within hours. A bucket shared among 100 people, emptied through a gap in the floorboards. The temperature in early spring dropping below. Freezing at night. The darkness, the sounds of people around you, crying children, praying elderly, the silence of people who have stopped talking because there is nothing left to say. People die in the cars before the train reaches its destination. Elderly people whose bodies cannot sustain 5 to 8 days of these conditions. Infants who cannot survive the cold and the dehydration. People whose health was already compromised by 2 years of occupation and the deliberate restrictions the Germans had placed on Jewish access to food and medicine. When the train stops, it stops inside Auschwitz-Birkenau. The doors open. The people who step out have survived in conditions designed to weaken and disorient them. They emerge blinking into the organized chaos that the SS have perfected through hundreds of previous transports. Guards with dogs, searchlights, orders shouted in German that most of the Thessaloniki Jews do not understand because they speak Greek and Ladino, not German or Polish. The immediate violent separation of men from women. The shouting, the dogs, and then the selection. The SS doctors who conduct the selection are looking for people capable of labor, young adults in reasonable health. The process takes minutes per person, a gesture of the hand, left or right, life or death. Though no one says this, everyone else, the elderly, children under 14 or 15, mothers with young children who will not be separated from them, the sick, anyone who does not appear capable of sustained, heavy labor, is directed to one side. They are told they are going to shower, that they will receive new clothes, that they will meet their families afterward. They are taken to the gas chambers. Among the Thessaloniki Jews arriving on the early transports, the selection produces its brutal arithmetic. Of each transport of 2,800 people, somewhere between 20 and 30% are selected for labor. The remaining 70 to 80%, the majority, the elderly, the children, the mothers who will not leave their children, are killed within hours of arrival. Erica Amarillo is 17 years old. She is healthy. She is selected for labor. She watches her transport divided. She watches people she knows directed to the left. She does not yet fully understand what the left means. She will understand within days. What she witnesses and endures in Auschwitz-Birkenau over the following months is documented in her post-war testimony with the specific precision of trauma memory, not in broad strokes, but in exact details, exact moments, exact sensory impressions that refuse to fade across decades. She remembers the smell, the specific, constant, omnipresent smell of Auschwitz that every survivor describes, the smell of burning that was always there, that came from the crematoria that operated continuously, that everyone knew the source of, and that no one spoke about directly because speaking about it directly meant acknowledging what it meant. She remembers the sound of Ladino. In the barracks, among the Thessaloniki women who had been selected for labor, the sound of their own language, medieval Spanish that their ancestors had carried from Iberia in 1492, was a specific comfort in a place designed to strip away every marker of identity. They were Jews from Thessaloniki, in a camp where they were called numbers, but among themselves, in the language their grandmothers had taught them, they were still themselves. She remembers the Greek Jews who did not come back from selections, the women who were taken from the barracks and did not return, the rumors about what happened to them that were not rumors but facts that everyone knew and no one said directly. She remembers the hunger. Auschwitz hunger was a specific, constant, physical reality that altered perception and thought and the ability to care about anything beyond the next meal, the soup that was barely soup, the bread that was barely bread, the systematic starvation that was part of the camp's design, weakening the prisoners gradually, making sustained resistance impossible. Back in Thessaloniki, the transports continue. Every few days, another group is assembled at Baron Hirsch. Another cattle car train moves north. Another 2,800 people make the 5 to 8 day journey through March, through April, through May, through June, through July. Archbishop Damaskinos of Athens, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, writes a letter of protest to the collaborationist Greek government in March 1943. He collects signatures from prominent Greek intellectuals, professionals, and public figures. He risks his position and potentially his life to put on official record that what is being done to the Jews of Thessaloniki is a crime against humanity and a violation of every principle that Greek civilization claims to uphold. The letter is remarkable for its directness and its courage. It says explicitly that the deportations are unjust, that Greek Jews are Greek citizens, that their persecution is a stain on Greece. It is one of the clearest statements by any religious leader in occupied Europe during the deportations. The letter changes nothing operationally. The trains keep running, but it goes into the historical record. And it matters. Individual Greeks act as well. A doctor in Thessaloniki provides false medical certificates diagnosing Jewish patients with contagious diseases, making them temporarily unfeasible for deportation. A lawyer helps Jewish families obtain false identity papers, identifying them as Christian Greeks. A farmer in the countryside outside the city hides a Jewish family in his barn for months, sharing his own scarce food with them, knowing that if he is discovered, the consequences will be severe. These acts of rescue are not systematic. They do not save the majority. They save individual people, dozens, perhaps hundreds, scattered across a community of 50,000. But they happen, and the people they save carry the knowledge of what was done for them for the rest of their lives. The Jewish community of Thessaloniki had 2,000 years of history in the city. It had survived everything: the Turkish occupation, the Great Fire of 1917 that destroyed much of the Jewish quarter, the Greek nationalist pressures of the interwar period, the first year and a half of German occupation. It cannot survive 19 transports. By August 1943, the deportations are complete. Of the approximately 50,000 Jews deported from Thessaloniki to Auschwitz-Birkenau, approximately 1,950 survived the war. 1,950 out of 50,000. 96% are murdered. The ancient Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki, one of the largest Jewish cemeteries in Europe, containing approximately 500,000 graves, the accumulated dead of 2,000 years of Jewish life in the city, is bulldozed during the occupation. The headstones are broken up and used as building materials across the city. The grounds are converted into what eventually becomes the campus of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. 500,000 graves gone. The more than 30 synagogues of Thessaloniki, the Jewish schools, the Ladino newspapers, the cultural organizations built across 450 years of Sephardic life in the city. Gone. The Ladino language, medieval Spanish, preserved across 4.5 centuries of exile, carried from Spain in 1492 and spoken in the markets and homes of Thessaloniki until 1943, effectively dies with the community that carried it in Greece. Gone. You are watching this right now. Most people who know about the Holocaust know the broad outlines. They know about Poland and the major camps. They do not know about Thessaloniki, about the 2,000-year-old community that spoke a medieval Spanish language and ran the port of one of the Mediterranean's most important cities for 4 centuries. They do not know about the 19 transports and the 5 months and the 96%. If you believe this story deserves to be known, subscribe and hit the like button. We carry these stories so they don't disappear into silence. Erica Amarillo survives the selections at Auschwitz. She survives months in the women's camp. She survives the death marches of early 1945, the forced evacuations as Soviet forces advance, and the SS drives prisoners west on foot through winter conditions that kill thousands who survived years in the camps. She survives liberation. She returns to Thessaloniki. The destruction of Thessaloniki's Jewish community has consequences that extend in every direction: cultural, physical, linguistic, political, and that are still being processed 8 decades later. The first consequence is linguistic and irreversible. The Ladino language had survived for 450 years in Thessaloniki. It had evolved there, incorporating Greek and Turkish and Italian words while maintaining its essential character as a form of medieval Spanish. It had produced literature, poetry, plays, novels written in the Ladino of Thessaloniki. It had produced newspapers. La Epoca was one of the most important Ladino language newspapers in the world, published in Thessaloniki for decades. The destruction of the Thessaloniki community was the destruction of Ladino's most vital center. The language did not die entirely. Sephardic communities in Israel, Turkey, and the Americas maintained it. But the largest, most vibrant, most culturally productive community of Ladino speakers in the world was gone. Today, Ladino is classified as critically endangered. The number of native Ladino speakers can be counted in the thousands. UNESCO lists it among the languages at severe risk of extinction. A language carried across 450 years of exile, surviving the Spanish Inquisition, surviving the Ottoman Empire, surviving 4 centuries of change, not surviving 19 train transports. The second consequence is physical and ongoing. The ancient Jewish cemetery, 500,000 graves, was destroyed during the occupation. The university campus, built on its grounds, has been the subject of controversy, discussion, and gradual acknowledgement ever since. Fragments of Jewish headstones have been found incorporated into walls and foundations across the city for decades. In 2014, Aristotle University installed a monument acknowledging the cemetery that stood on its grounds. It is a gesture. It is not restoration. The third consequence is what Thessaloniki lost as a city. Cities are not just geography. They are the accumulated lives and contributions of the people who have lived in them. Thessaloniki, without its Jewish community, is a different city from Thessaloniki with it. The community that had run the port for centuries, that had built the commercial infrastructure, that had contributed to the city's cultural and intellectual life across 2,000 years of continuous presence. Its absence changed what the city was. The fourth consequence is the specific injustice of delayed recognition. For decades after the war, the destruction of the Jews of Thessaloniki did not receive the acknowledgement it deserved within Greek public memory. The post-war political situation, the Civil War, the Cold War, the specific dynamics of Greek national memory that centered on the resistance, created conditions in which the Jewish victims of the occupation were not always given prominence alongside the story of Greek resistance and Greek suffering. This has changed. Greek government acknowledgement has grown. Educational curricula have improved. The Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki, established in 1997, does important work, but the recognition came late. And Alois Brunner, one of the 2 men who organized the deportations, lived in Damascus under an assumed name for decades. He was never captured. He was never tried. He died in Syria sometime in the 1990s or early 2000s. The exact date is uncertain because the Syrian government never officially confirmed his death. He organized the murder of 48,000 people and died in his bed. Erica Amarillo returned to Thessaloniki after liberation. She found the city the same and completely different. The streets were the same. The buildings were largely the same. The harbor was the same harbor that Jewish dock workers had operated for centuries. The community was gone. She rebuilt her life. She eventually wrote down what she had lived through. Her testimony, Souvenirs de ma vie à Thessalonique, gives back to the historical record some of what was taken from it by the destruction of the community she grew up in. It is the testimony of a woman who was 17 years old when she was put on a cattle car, who survived Auschwitz and the death marches, who came home to an empty city, and who understood that remembering was something she owed to the people who did not come back. Of the 50,000 Jews Deported from Thessaloniki, 1,950 survived the war. Some of them returned. Most of those who returned eventually left, for Israel, for Western Europe, for the United States. The community that had been 50,000 strong contracted to a few hundred, then slowly to roughly 1,000 people today. 1,000 where there were 50,000. Dieter Wisliceni was tried at Nuremberg. He provided testimony about the implementation of the final solution that contributed to the prosecution's case against other defendants. He was then handed over to Czechoslovakia, tried for his crimes there, and executed in 1948. Alois Brunner was never brought to justice. The 500,000 graves are under a university campus. The synagogues that remain, a handful out of more than 30, are maintained by the small community that still exists. The Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki tells the story for those who come to hear it. And the Ladino language that the community carried from Spain in 1492 and preserved in Thessaloniki for 450 years grows quieter every year as its last native speakers age, and the language they carry ages with them. 2,000 years, 19 transports, 5 months, 96%. These numbers describe what happened. They do not describe Erika Amarillo standing on a Thessaloniki street after liberation, looking at a city that remembered nothing of what she had lost. They do not describe the sound of Ladino in the Thessaloniki markets, medieval Spanish preserved for 450 years, falling permanently silent. They do not describe the 500,000 graves under the university campus. What the numbers cannot describe, the testimony can. Erika Amarillo wrote it down. The Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki preserves it. And this video carries it forward. If this story is still in your head right now, if you're still thinking about it, that like button is the right response. Hit it. This channel carries these stories carefully. Every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. If this story connects to your family's history, any family, any country, tell us in the comments. These moments belong to everyone. Thank you for carrying the weight of the Jews of Thessaloniki forward. They bore something heavier than we can properly imagine. They carried a language across 450 years of exile and preserved it in a city that became their home. The least we can do is remember where they went.